The office buzzed with the usual sounds: phones ringing, keyboards clicking, whispers between colleagues. It was the kind of noise that filled a corporate space, yet somehow felt empty, mechanical. No one noticed David as he stepped inside. A middle-aged black man, his clothes unassuming, his presence quiet but commanding in its own way. He walked past the reception desk, his gaze briefly meeting the receptionist's before she looked away, disinterested. "Deliveries go around the back," she muttered, her voice flat. David nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned to leave, but not before noticing the way she spoke to him, dismissing him without a second thought. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But David wasn't just any delivery man today. Upstairs, the atmosphere was entirely different. The boardroom buzzed with chatter, the sound of the elite at work. Claire, one of the sharpest and most ruthless executives in the company, stood at the head of the table, her heels clicking as she walked around, commanding the room. Her voice was smooth, dripping with authority, but there was something else in it. A sense of superiority that made the air heavy. The employees around her nodded, hanging onto her every word. "Let's face it, the diversity hires don't really do much," Claire scoffed, glancing around the table. "Just another reason why this place will never truly reach its potential." She paused, surveying the room, her gaze finally settling on the back of the room. She smirked. "And don't get me started on the delivery guy I just passed. Honestly, some people just think they can waltz in here and demand respect." The room chuckled softly at her words, the laughter almost polite, meant to please, but not real. They all knew who Claire was and how she ruled. Fear was woven into her confidence, and everyone could feel it. But Claire had no idea what was coming. David stood just outside the boardroom, listening from the shadows, his mind calculating. He had heard her words. He had heard it all before, but today was different. Today, he wasn't the man she thought he was. Today, the man she mocked behind closed doors would walk into the room as the new CEO. David felt a deep, quiet pride rise in his chest. He had come here to do more than reclaim what was his. He had come to make a point that would shake this entire company to its core. The power struggle was about to begin. Claire, with her polished exterior and ruthless tactics, was about to meet a force she never saw coming. David pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. A message appeared from his lawyer. "It's done. The deal is final. You're the new CEO." He took a deep breath. The weight of the responsibility hung on his shoulders, but he didn't feel burdened by it. He felt liberated. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment he had worked for in silence, away from the prying eyes of the corporate world. Inside the boardroom, Kay's laughter still echoed. She was oblivious, as always. She continued to push her agenda, but David knew that the illusion of control was fragile. As the laughter died down, he finally walked in. The room went silent. Claire looked up, her face contorting with surprise, confusion, and a flash of recognition. Her eyes widened when she saw David standing there. He had been the delivery guy, the one she had belittled without a second thought. But now, here he was, standing tall, dressed not as a mere employee, but as the embodiment of power. The entire room seemed to freeze. David smiled faintly, letting the moment linger. "I'm sorry, did I interrupt something?" he asked coolly, his voice smooth yet sharp enough to cut through the tension. Claire's face reddened, her arrogance cracking. She quickly regained her composure, masking the brief moment of panic. "Well," she said, trying to recover, "I didn't expect you so soon, Mr. CEO. But I see you've come to join the team after all." Her smile was thin, forced. The board members, those who had once been loyal to Claire, exchanged glances. They had seen David at the company before, but they hadn't known who he was, at least, not until now. David walked forward slowly, every step purposeful. "Actually, Claire," he said, his tone never losing its calm edge, I'm not here to join the team. I'm here to lead it. The words hit harder than any slap, echoing through the room. Claire's confident facade began to crack, revealing the unease she had hidden for so long. Claire's eyes narrowed as she tried to regain control. What is this, some kind of joke? She hissed, her voice losing its edge. You? The CEO. You're nothing but a delivery guy. Do you really think I'll just hand over everything I've worked for to someone like you? David's lips curled into a calm smile. You didn't hand it to me, Claire. You lost it. And with that, the game began. The room held its breath. Who would rise from this power struggle? Who would be left standing at the end? You've got more to offer than this, David. The words echoed in his mind as David stepped into his small apartment after a long day of work. The creaking door closed behind him, the only sound that filled the quiet room. The weight of his backpack, laden with deliveries, was the least of his burdens. The real weight, the one that had settled in his chest for years, was his own quiet frustration. He had always carried it, sometimes in silence, sometimes through words, but it never seemed to go away. David had spent decades making do with what life had given him. A modest job as a courier wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. His days were filled with deliveries, moving packages from point A to point B. It was all he had known. Yet, even as he walked the streets with his head down, hands full of parcels, David carried with him a sense of dignity, a quiet resolve that pushed him forward. It was the kind of strength people didn't notice, too subtle, too silent to be seen, but it was there. On the outside, David's life seemed normal. He lived in a modest building on the edge of the city, a far cry from the sleek skyscrapers and polished corporate offices of the world he once dreamed of. The walls of his apartment were adorned with pictures from his past, family photos, a few sketches of his community projects, a tattered piece of paper with his dream scrawled across it. Haven Initiative. It was a dream, but a dream he couldn't shake. A vision for a community built not on the foundations of wealth, but on the foundations of love and mutual support. A place where young people could learn, where families could grow, and where neighbors could depend on each other. In between deliveries, David often sat down to sketch, letting his imagination flow into the pages. His fingers traced out plans for schools, small businesses, and community gardens. But those sketches, as hopeful as they were, often sat untouched. "Hey, David," a voice called out, snapping him out of his thoughts as he walked toward the office for his next delivery. It was Marcos, one of the young men from the neighborhood David had been mentoring for months. Marcos was in his late teens, with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that David didn't want to extinguish. He'd seen too many kids from the neighborhood fall into despair, but Marcos was different. "You working on that thing again?" Marcos asked. He nodded toward the sketchbook in David's hand. David smiled faintly. "Just some ideas. Trying to figure out how to make it work." Marcos raised an eyebrow. "You're always saying that, Mr. David. You've got to put some of those plans into action. Maybe not tomorrow, but you can start small, right?" David nodded. "You're right. I've just got to find the right people." "You're one of the right people," Marcos said, flashing a grin. David chuckled. "Maybe. But we all need each other to make it happen." David's lunch breaks were often spent with the younger employees at the corporate office, the ones who didn't speak up but looked to him for quiet wisdom. He had always been the type to see potential in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. As he sat in the break room, surrounded by eager young faces, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of pride and sadness. These kids had dreams, but they also had no idea what they were up against. "Mr. David," a young man named Raphael said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I heard they're letting people go again." David glanced up from his sandwich, sensing the weight of the conversation. "They always say that when things slow down. But you've got to keep pushing through it. Don't get discouraged by the noise. Focus on what you can control." Raphael nodded, his face a mixture of concern and hope. "Thanks, Mr. David. I tried to keep going. I just don't know if it's worth it sometimes." David smiled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes, it's just about surviving long enough to get to the next opportunity. But remember, it's about building something that lasts, not just something you can quit when it gets hard." David's words lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, Raphael's face softened with understanding. He didn't have all the answers, but he was giving them something. He was planting a seed. Despite his own struggles, David always seemed to be there for others. The small wins, whether it was helping a coworker who had been passed over for promotion or advising a troubled youth, kept him going. At the office, though, things weren't always so simple. The microaggressions were subtle, but they were real. As David entered the elevator one morning, he greeted Amanda, a middle manager who worked in human resources. She didn't respond, her eyes glued to her phone. The others in the elevator glanced at him briefly, but no one offered a word. It was an awkward silence that David had grown used to. Later that day, he asked his direct manager, Tom, a quiet, slightly nervous man, about the status of a particular delivery. Tom sighed and rubbed his forehead. "David, it's not that I don't appreciate you being here. It's just that we're really busy, and we have, well, higher priorities right now," Tom said, his voice trailing off. David nodded, his face impassive. "No problem. I'll make sure it gets done." Another day, another dismissal. But David didn't let it break him. He just kept going, one step at a time. One evening, David was walking home after a long day when he bumped into Kenny, an old friend from his early days working with the company. Kenny was holding a few papers in his hand, a grim look on his face. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't think I'd be the one to tell you this, but I heard the company's been making some big changes. They're looking for new leadership. Someone with, let's say, the right kind of experience." David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard anything about this, but he knew what Kenny was implying. The company was restructuring, looking to fill gaps where the old leadership had failed. But David had been here long enough to know that these changes usually came with strings attached. David muttered slowly, his mind racing. "Thanks for the heads up, Kenny. I'll keep an eye out." Kenny looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Man, you've got a lot more power in this place than you know. Don't let them play you. Don't let them forget who built this place." David's pulse quickened. Kenny's cryptic words rattled in his mind. Was there more to the story than he had realized? Was this the opportunity he had been waiting for? As David returned to his apartment, the weight of everything he had learned that day settled heavily in his chest. There was something bigger going on, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. His dream, Haven Initiative, was still just a sketch on a piece of paper, but maybe it was time for it to become more. Maybe it was time for David to step into a bigger role, one where he could make a lasting impact, not just as a mentor on the sidelines, but as someone who truly led. He stared out his window at the city skyline, the lights flickering as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was a shift coming, and David was ready to be at the heart of it. Cliffhanger. The next day, David receives an unexpected call from the company's board. They want to meet with him. But why? And what could this mean for his future? David sat in the break room, mindlessly stirring his coffee. The usual clink of spoons against mugs and the low hum of conversations didn't bother him. He'd grown used to it, like he'd grown used to the glances that never quite met his eyes, the polite smiles that never reached anyone's soul. But today was different. Today, the air felt thicker. The kind of thickness that settles in when something is about to shift, when the storm is coming, but no one sees it until it's too late. David glanced at the clock. It was almost time for his break to end. He needed to get back to work, finish his deliveries, and head home to plan the next step in his long-simmering plan. But as he turned to leave, the door swung open, and there she was. Claire, The woman who had made it her mission to remind David, and everyone else, that she ruled this place. She entered with the same sharp confidence she always had, heels clicking on the floor as if the sound of her steps demanded everyone's attention. "Out of my way, delivery boy," Claire sneered as she passed David. The words hit David like a slap in the face, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stayed seated, letting her walk past him. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Claire had been playing this game for months, mocking him behind his back, calling him just another cog in the machine, when she thought he couldn't hear. He had endured it all silently. But today, he felt something stirring within him. A calm, quiet anger that had been building for years, ever since he'd been forced out of the company he had once helped build. But today, something would be different. Claire stopped in front of the coffee machine, her back to him. She was talking to a few of the other employees, and David could hear her clearly. "You know," Claire said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "I just don't understand why someone like him even bothers. People like him should know their place. Honestly, I can't even remember the last time I saw him do something useful around here. Just a glorified delivery boy." She laughed, her tone cutting through the air. "I wonder if they even know how to do anything else." David's breath hitched, but he didn't move. He didn't say a word. Claire, oblivious to his presence, continued to mock him, oblivious to the fact that the very thing she belittled was about to change everything. One of the employees, a younger man named Lucas, looked nervously at David. He knew better than to speak up, but his discomfort was evident in his shifting gaze. But David just stayed still, his face unreadable. The weight of Claire's words settled over the room like a dark cloud. It wasn't the first time she'd made remarks like that. It wasn't the first time she had belittled someone who wasn't in her elite circle. But today, it felt different. Today, the world David had quietly accepted was about to be turned upside down. As Claire finished her tirade, she glanced over her shoulder and caught David's eye. For a split second, their gazes locked. There was a flicker of recognition. Though it was fleeting, Claire quickly masked it with a smug smile. "Isn't it just precious how they think they can get ahead by doing the bare minimum?" she said to the others, making sure David heard every word. David stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room went quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting for David to say something. But he didn't need to speak. The way he stood there, calm and unshaken, sent a powerful message. "I think you said enough, Claire," he said, his voice measured and steady. The words hung in the air, as if the room itself paused to listen. Claire's eyes narrowed. She didn't expect him to respond. She never thought he would. "Excuse me," she snapped. David didn't flinch. He simply stood there, every inch of him radiating a quiet power that he had long hidden. "I said, you've said enough." Claire's face flushed with anger. "You have no place to talk to me like that," she sneered. "You're just a delivery guy. You think you can." David cut her off, his tone never wavering. "I think you forget who's been carrying this company for the last few months. Who's been here when you and your little clique didn't bother to show up? Who's done more for this company than you'll ever know?" There was a long pause. Claire opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. She stared at David, the shock evident on her face. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to people like David, people she thought she could break, fighting back. But what Claire didn't know, what no one knew, was that David was no longer just the delivery guy. A brief flashback flickers in David's mind. He was younger then, sitting in a meeting with the original founders of the company. Back when he had been a visionary, a key player, before the politics had driven him out. David had been one of the founding members of the company, and his resignation had been orchestrated behind closed doors, by people just like Claire. The founders had trusted him. They had believed in him. They'd given him the chance to build the company into something greater. But the company's power structure had changed, and David had been pushed aside. His ideas, his contributions, his very presence erased, but he had kept the company shares. Quietly, in the background, he had watched as others tried, and failed, to carry the company forward. Back to present. David's phone buzzed. He glanced at the message notification. Your appointment as CEO will be announced tomorrow. His heart skipped a beat. The time had come. The power he had been quietly reclaiming over the last few months was about to be his, officially. But it wasn't just the title that mattered. It was the responsibility. The chance to change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked by people like Claire. Cliffhanger. As David stepped out of the break room, Claire watched him go, her expression a mix of confusion and rage. She hadn't heard the last of him. The company was about to see who David really was. David sat in the back corner of his small office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The hum was almost too loud, but he didn't mind it. He needed to stay focused. His thoughts were elsewhere, racing back in time, to a place where he had once belonged, before everything was torn apart, before he was cast out. How did I get here? He thought, rubbing the back of his neck, a slight tension between his shoulders. The weight of it all was too much to carry some days, but today, it wasn't the past that haunted him. It was the present. David had been working at the company for a while now, but only in the shadows. Claire, with her sharp, cutting words, had tried to write him off, and for a while, he had let her. After all, he was just a delivery guy, right? Just someone doing his job, staying out of the way. But that had all changed. The truth was coming into focus, and David wasn't just going to sit back and let this moment slip away. Not again. Flashback. David could see it in his mind's eye. The boardroom, bright lights shining down on his young face, filled with ideas and dreams. He had been a founder, one of the driving forces behind the company in its early days. The sacrifices he made, the sleepless nights, the relentless push for success, all of it had been for the company, for the people, and most importantly, for the vision he had crafted. But then, corporate politics stepped in. The founders began to turn on each other, whispering about profits, about control. David had been forced out. It wasn't his vision that was the problem. It was his presence. The company wanted someone more palatable. Someone who didn't challenge the status quo. Someone like Claire. David had taken a backseat, watching from the shadows, seeing his hard work twisted into something unrecognizable. His shares in the company were a reminder of the life he'd once had, but they were also a quiet rebellion against the powers that had cast him aside. The vision he once had wasn't lost. It was just waiting. Waiting for the right moment to rise again. Back to present. As David sat in his office now, the weight of the company's dysfunction pressing in on him, his thoughts kept circling back to the same thing. Claire. She had climbed to the top by stepping on people like him. She had fostered a culture of fear, where people kept their heads down, where success was measured by who you knew and not by the work you did. David's observations told him everything he needed to know. The company was a machine, but it wasn't working right. People were scared, and Claire's control was brittle, like a house of cards ready to topple. The employees were unhappy. Some were even afraid to speak out. It wasn't just Claire's words that kept them in line. It was the culture she had created, one that demanded conformity and punished any hint of dissent. David's attention snapped back to the present as he heard footsteps outside his office. He quickly pushed the papers aside and composed himself. Lucas, a young, eager employee who had been working under David for the past few months, walked in, looking nervous. His hands were twitching with anxiety, but his eyes were full of something else. Something that David had come to recognize: fear. "David," Lucas said, his voice shaky, "can I talk to you for a minute?" David nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lucas hesitated before speaking. "It's about Claire. She's been saying things about you, about how you've been trying to change things. She's angry, she said. Lucas gulped, then lowered his voice. She said she's going to make sure you don't get the promotion. She doesn't want anyone who doesn't fit her idea of things. David didn't flinch. He'd known Claire would eventually target him, but hearing it from someone else still stung. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "It's okay, Lucas," David said quietly. "You're doing good work here. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You don't have to agree with her, and you don't have to play her game." "But I don't know how much longer I can take this," Lucas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been here for 2 years, and nothing changes. It's always the same, always about what she wants." David sighed, feeling the weight of Lucas's words. The employees at this company had been living under a cloud for too long. They didn't know it yet, but they were all part of something bigger than they realized. "You're not alone, Lucas," David said, his voice firm. "And neither are the others. Things are going to change around here. You can count on that." That evening, David sat at his desk, his mind swirling. He had gathered enough evidence now. Claire's lies, her manipulation of the company's finances, their disregard for anyone who didn't fit her vision. It was all there. And David had been collecting pieces of it, bit by bit, for months. But it wasn't just about exposing Claire. It was about something bigger. The system she had built was broken, and it wasn't enough to just tear it down. It had to be rebuilt. David had to rebuild it. He reached for a dusty box under his desk, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were old documents, agreements, contracts, and the final, crucial piece, a legal agreement from the original founders. The agreement that gave David more power than Claire ever realized. It was his leverage. As he held the document in his hands, the pieces began to fit together. His plan was clear now. He wasn't just going to expose Claire's corruption. He was going to take back what was rightfully his, what had always been his. Cliffhanger. As David stares at the document, the realization hits him like a tidal wave. He holds in his hands the key to everything. Not just his future, but the future of the company. His next move could change everything. But first, he needed to decide how to play his cards, and the time to act was coming. The sharp hum of the office was deafening, yet somehow, David felt calm. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of control. His first days as CEO had been exhausting but promising. He had made subtle moves, quietly improving conditions for employees, offering mentorship, and inspiring them to stand up for themselves. The shift was slow, but it was real. David had always believed in leading by example. He didn't need grand gestures. He just needed to show the employees that they were worthy of respect, that they deserved better than the toxic culture Claire had cultivated. In the break room, David caught a glimpse of Raphael, a young employee who had been working under him for months. Raphael had always been nervous, unsure of himself. But today, as he sipped his coffee, his posture was different. He stood taller, more confident. David smiled quietly to himself, watching the ripple effect of his actions. He had spent years teaching people like Raphael that their voices mattered, that they didn't have to tolerate the condescending attitudes from people like Claire. Slowly, but surely, he was changing things. But Claire wasn't one to go down without a fight. The whispers began shortly after. David could feel the shift, the subtle stares from some of the upper management. The way employees hesitated before speaking to him, as though they were unsure which side to be on. The silence had changed. It was no longer just oppressive. It was charged, filled with suspicion. David was no fool. He knew Claire wouldn't just sit back and let him take over the company, especially after everything she had fought for. But he wasn't expecting her to strike so soon. David was walking through the halls when he overheard 2 employees, Lucy and Ethan, talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear? David's been using his position to push personal projects through," Lucy whispered. "I heard he's just trying to climb the ladder. Some CEO. He's just an opportunist." David froze for a second. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. He had worked so hard to turn this place around, to rebuild trust where Claire had torn it apart. But the words felt like a slap to the face. The rumors were starting, and David knew exactly who was behind them. Later that day, David sat in his office, trying to focus on the stack of papers in front of him. His phone buzzed with a text message from his lawyer. "You need to be careful. Claire's already reached out to some of the board members. They're starting to question your motives." David stared at the phone, his fingers tightening around it. His momentum had been building, but now, it felt like everything was starting to unravel. He couldn't afford to let Claire get to him. Not now. Not when things were just beginning to turn in his favor. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Elena, an older woman who had worked in the company for years, entered, her face strained. She had been one of the first employees to support David when he started making changes. But now, even her demeanor had shifted. She was cautious, her eyes darting around the room as if checking for anyone listening. "David," she began quietly, "I just wanted to let you know. Things are getting tense. Some of the senior managers are talking about your background. They're wondering if you've really got what it takes to lead this company." It's all getting back to Claire. David exhaled sharply. He knew the weight of these words. He had known Claire would go after him, but hearing it from Elena made it all too real. The game was changing. Claire wasn't just attacking his character anymore. She was trying to destroy his credibility. And it was working. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," David said, his voice low but steady. "But I didn't think she would be this ruthless." Elena shook her head. "She's playing dirty, David. I'm not sure how much longer the board will hold out against her." The next morning, David arrived at the office earlier than usual. He wanted to get ahead of things, to put some space between himself and the storm he knew was coming. But when he stepped off the elevator, he was met with an unexpected sight. Claire stood at the entrance of the boardroom, flanked by a few of her loyalists. She wore that same smug expression, the one that told David she thought she had already won. "You're early," Claire said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. David didn't reply immediately. He studied her, seeing the cracks in her carefully constructed image. She knew the tide was turning. She was trying to hold on to whatever scraps of power she could. "I'm just getting started," David finally said, his voice steady and firm. "And this company is too important for you to continue running it like your personal playground." Claire's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward the boardroom door and entered, leaving David standing alone in the hallway, his mind racing. The day wore on, and David felt the tension rise. Every meeting seemed to come with an extra layer of suspicion. His decisions were being questioned more than usual. The employees who had once been hopeful now looked uncertain. By the time David received another call from his lawyer, his nerves were frayed. "They're pushing back hard," his lawyer said. "The board is split. Some of them are leaning toward Claire. They think she's more qualified, even though we both know that's not true. We need something big to turn this around, David." David's mind raced. What could he do? He needed leverage. He needed something that would expose Claire's true nature. That night, as he sat in his office, going over paperwork, he found it. Hidden in the back of an old file, an agreement between the company's founders. It was a document he had completely forgotten about, a legal clause that granted him substantial control over the company's leadership structure. This was his moment. This was the key to taking control once and for all. Cliffhanger. Just as David was about to make his move, the phone buzzed again. The text read, "Claire's going to make her final play tomorrow. Be ready." David stared at the screen. This was it. Everything was about to come to a head. Would he finally win, or would Claire succeed in tearing everything down? "You don't know what it's like, do you?" Elena's voice echoed through David's office, soft but filled with a quiet fury. She stood there, nervously wringing her hands, as David watched her from his desk. The silence between them was heavy, thick with anticipation. David leaned forward in his chair, his gaze locked with hers. "What are you trying to say, Elena?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp, like a blade waiting to strike. He had trusted her once, but this was different now. Everything was different. Elena hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of her sleeve. "I've got something you need to see," she said, her eyes darting toward the door as if checking for anyone listening. She slid a manila envelope across the desk. It was unmarked, plain, almost too ordinary to hold the weight of what was inside. David's heart beat faster. He didn't need to open it. He knew. This was it. The leverage he had been waiting for. The truth had been sitting there in plain sight, waiting for someone to dig deep enough. And now, Elena was here with the answers David needed. As he opened the envelope, the documents inside spilled out like a floodgate of secrets. Falsified financial reports, documents with Claire's signature on them, questionable hires. It was all there. Claire's reign had been built on lies, manipulation, and greed. But now, David could see it for what it truly was, a house of cards. He leaned back in his chair, stunned. How had it come to this? Elena's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I knew it was wrong," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I tried to expose her before. I tried to tell the board, but she had too many people in her pocket. She got rid of me, kicked me out." David's gaze softened for a moment. He could feel the weight of Elena's words, the years of frustration that had built up inside her. "It wasn't your fault," he said quietly. "You were doing the right thing. But Claire, she's a snake." Claire's control over the company had always been a delicate thing, a balance between fear and favor. But now, with this evidence in hand, David knew he could shatter her empire in one swift move. He glanced at Elena. Her past with Claire had been hard, but this was her redemption. Together, they could bring the truth to light. The plan. As the days passed, David began to move carefully. He wasn't going to rush into this. Claire's downfall would be his doing, but it had to be methodical, subtle. He started reaching out to a few key employees, ones who had always been overlooked or silenced by Claire, the ones who had witnessed her corruption, but were too afraid to speak out. Raphael, a quiet worker who had always admired David's calm strength, was one of the first to come forward. "I never liked the way things were going," Raphael said, his voice barely audible as he spoke to David in the back office. "People like Claire, they only care about themselves. The rest of us are just here to make her look good." David nodded, understanding. He wasn't surprised by the revelation. Claire's abuse of power had always been in the open, but no one had dared challenge her, until now. With the support of Raphael and Elena, David started to build a small, quiet coalition, one that would expose Claire's greed and deceit. Small wins, but powerful. One by one, employees came forward, each with a small but crucial piece of the puzzle. Each testimony added to the growing evidence that Claire's empire was built on lies. The company's financials had been manipulated. Contracts had been altered. Jobs were given to those who could be controlled, while employees who questioned her were fired or marginalized. David, with Elena's help, began to compile everything into a concise dossier. It was time for the board to know the truth. But David's rise was not without challenges. Claire's suspicion grew as the days passed. She began to watch him more closely, her icy stare following him at meetings. David could feel her eyes on him, watching, calculating. One afternoon, as he passed Claire's office, she called out to him. Her voice was tight, barely controlled. "David," she said, stepping out from behind her desk. "I think you and I need to have a little talk." David turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "About what?" Claire smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been hearing things," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "People are talking. They say you've been making changes. You've been talking to the wrong people." David didn't flinch. He didn't rise to her bait. He just stood there, looking at her. "I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice cool. "Unlike some people, I'm here to make things better." For a moment, the tension between them was thick, palpable. But Claire didn't say anything more. She simply turned back to her office, her heels kicking sharply against the floor. David knew she was dangerous, but he was ready. As the days wore on, the pressure began to mount. The board members were starting to question the changes David had made. They were unsure. Some of them were loyal to Claire. Some were still unsure of his true intentions. And that uncertainty began to show. They wavered when David pushed for transparency. They hesitated when he demanded answers about the company's books. David, however, wasn't deterred. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to back down. In the dead of night, he sat at his desk, poring over the documents one last time. The evidence was undeniable, and with Elena's help, he was ready to present it to the board. Claire's corruption would be exposed, and she would have no way of stopping him. Just as David prepared to send the final report to the board, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Elena. The text was simple. "She knows. She's coming for you." David felt a chill run down his spine. Claire's rage was coming. The final battle was about to begin. The boardroom was eerily quiet as the board members settled into their seats. Tension hung thick in the air, every eye trained on David, who stood at the head of the table, a calm storm in the center of the chaos. Claire, sitting across from him, couldn't hide the unease that was creeping into her expression. David had waited for this moment for far too long. The game had been in motion for weeks. Claire had underestimated him, mistaking his silence for weakness. But today, it was all about to change. He was done playing by her rules. His voice broke the silence, cutting through the thick atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his tone controlled but full of weight. "I'm here today to share the truth about this company, about Claire, and about my role in all of this." The room stilled, eyes darting from David to Claire, then back to David. David set the folder on the table. He didn't need to say anything more. The evidence was in front of them, the falsified financial reports, the illegal hiring practices, the blatant disregard for ethics. Each document spoke volumes. But it wasn't just the documents that would bring Claire down. It was his story, his truth. He flipped open the folder, and the first piece of evidence was laid bare. "This," he said, his finger pointing at the first page, "is a report showing Claire's manipulation of company finances. I have all the proof here that she has been embezzling funds for years." Claire's face, once confident and smug, started to pale as she realized the gravity of what David was about to reveal. She straightened in her chair, trying to regain her composure, but it was clear that the walls were closing in. "This isn't just about money," David continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's about power, how Claire manipulated the board, how she controlled you all with fear, and how she built her empire on lies. A house of cards, built with the trust of the very people she's crushed under her heel." The room shifted uneasily. Claire's face tightened, her jaw clenched. She tried to speak, but David held up his hand. "Let me finish, Claire," he said. His eyes never left hers. He wasn't done. Not yet. David's mind flashed back to the past, back to the moment when everything started. The moment when he was forced out of the company he had founded. He had been betrayed, his vision stolen. Claire had risen to power through underhanded tactics, exploiting a loophole in the company's ownership structure, a loophole that David himself had inadvertently created. Through flashbacks, we see the company's early days. David, younger and full of hope, working alongside the founders to create something they all believed in. His face lights up with passion as he pitches the company's potential to the board. He sees the spark of possibility in their eyes, but he doesn't see the shadows growing behind him. And then, it all came crashing down. The manipulation of votes, the backroom deals. Claire had swooped in, using David's vulnerability to seize control. It was the one thing David had never anticipated, that the system he had trusted would be the one that betrayed him. "I wasn't the one who gave Claire the power," David said, his voice breaking the silence again. "But I am the one who's taking it back." He laid out the final piece of the puzzle, a document that had sat hidden for years, one that gave him a rightful claim to the CEO position. "I didn't just found this company. I built it, and I have the right to lead it again." The room was still. The board members exchanged glances, some surprised, others wary. David's revelation had stunned them. They had no idea. They had no idea that the man they'd been dismissing for years, the delivery guy, the silent worker, was not only the original architect of the company, but had never truly lost control of it. David's voice became stronger, more assured. He could see the change in the room. The tension that had once been directed at him was now shifting, now focusing on Claire. "For too long, Claire has controlled this company with lies. She has manipulated each of you, played on your fear, your doubts. It's time to end it." The board members, those who had once been loyal to Claire, those who had allowed her to carry on, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was no longer just about the documents. It was about what they now knew. David was not just a part of this company's past. He was its future. Claire's composure began to crack. She could feel the walls closing in, and her grip on the situation was slipping. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. "This is a lie," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "David has no right. He's nothing but a disgruntled former employee. You can't let him take control." David stood his ground. "The truth is, Claire, you've already lost. You just don't know it yet." The board members, who had once been afraid to speak out, began to murmur among themselves. It was happening. The power was shifting. David had won them over with his integrity, his vision for the company, and the undeniable truth of his words. But Claire wasn't done yet. She was desperate. She turned to the board, her eyes wild with fury. "You can't let him do this. Do you really think he'll run this company? He's a nobody. He'll ruin everything we've built." Her voice rose, but the confidence was gone. All that remained was fear. David's eyes were unwavering. "The only thing I'll ruin is the toxic culture you've built here." As the meeting continued, the atmosphere grew more tense. The board members, once loyal to Claire, were now uncertain. They had seen the truth, the undeniable evidence, and it was clear that David was the rightful leader. Yet, the battle wasn't over. There was still a decision to be made. Cliffhanger. The chairman of the board stood up, his voice echoing through the room. "We need a vote," he said, looking between David and Claire. The room held its breath. It's time to decide, Claire's future or David's. David's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. David stood at the head of the table, his hands resting calmly on the smooth surface. His gaze was steady, unwavering, despite the storm that was about to break. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, building alliances, and fighting a battle no one even knew he was fighting. And now, it was time to end it. On the other side of the room, Claire shifted nervously in her seat, her fingers tapping against the edge of the table. She was doing her best to maintain control, but everyone could see the cracks. She had once ruled this room with an iron fist, but now, that grip was slipping. The vote. The one that would decide everything. It was supposed to be a formality, an easy decision to keep things as they were. But that was before David had exposed the truth. As the board members murmured among themselves, Claire leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she addressed the group. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I'll tell you this. You cannot let David take control. He's just a distraction, an opportunist." Her voice was a bit too loud, her words laced with venom, trying to drown out the growing unease in the room. Easier to tear everything down, to destroy what we've worked for. Her eyes flickered to David, her lips curling into a bitter sneer. You really think he cares about this company? He's using you all to make a name for himself. David stood silent, unflinching. He wasn't going to let her words shake him. She had underestimated him for so long, and now he was about to show her that it wasn't just about power. It was about integrity, honesty, and loyalty to the people who had been silenced for far too long. David's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Claire's increasing desperation. This company was built on my vision, Claire continued, her voice rising, eyes darting to each board member. David doesn't understand it. He doesn't know what it takes to lead this company. But David knew something Claire didn't. He didn't need to understand her lies. He just needed to stand tall in the face of them. He cleared his throat, breaking the tension in the room. All eyes turned to him. There was no arrogance in his voice, no anger, just quiet strength. It's not about what you've built, Claire. It's about what you've destroyed. The words hit harder than any of the accusations Claire had hurled at him. The board members exchanged glances. David was not just speaking from a place of anger, but from the truth, and they could feel it. He wasn't playing her game anymore. Flashback. A brief moment flashed before David's eyes. He remembered the early days, sitting at the same table, a younger version of himself filled with ambition, working alongside the very people who now sat quietly watching him. The founders of the company had trusted him, given him responsibility, until Claire took it all away. David had never asked for this power. He had simply wanted the company to thrive. But Claire had been driven by her hunger for control. She had torn down everyone who stood in her way. The whispers of betrayal, the manipulations, David had seen it all. And now, he was reclaiming what was rightfully his. Back to the boardroom. David took a deep breath, then turned toward the board members. You've heard the lies, seen the manipulation. It's time to put an end to it. Claire's reign of fear ends today. The room was silent. The truth was in front of them. The financial records, the discriminatory hiring practices, the evidence of Claire's embezzlement. It was undeniable. The chairman, Harold, shifted in his seat, his face pale as he glanced at the board members. There was no denying it. They had been misled, used, and manipulated. The power structure they had grown accustomed to was crumbling. Claire's face turned red as she stood up abruptly, her hands slamming onto the table. You think this will change anything? She spat, her voice shaking with fury. People like me always come out on top, always. Her words echoed in the room, but this time, there was no one to back her up. The board members, the employees who had silently watched, were all too aware of the truth. David didn't flinch. Maybe in your world, Claire, he said calmly, but not here. Not anymore. With those words, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was over. Claire's empire had crumbled in front of her eyes. The board members began to speak, some nodding, some still uncertain. But there was one thing they all knew now. David had earned this. He wasn't a thief or an opportunist. He was the man who had built the company, and he was the one who would lead it back to its true potential. The vote was swift. David's allies on the board had made their move. Claire was removed from her position. The room erupted into a low murmur of disbelief. Claire stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with shock. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But David wasn't done yet. As Claire was escorted out of the room, David turned to face the board, the weight of the moment settling over him. It's time to rebuild this company, he said, his voice steady. We will focus on fairness, transparency, and equality. We'll give people the chance they deserve, and we'll make sure no one ever has to feel powerless here again. David turned to Elena, standing in the corner, a small smile playing on her lips. She had been there from the start, helping him navigate this process, guiding him through the storm. As he stepped out of the boardroom, The employees in the hallway looked up in awe. They had heard the rumors. They had felt the tension. But now, they saw the truth. David was their leader. He smiled at them, the weight of the fight still heavy in his chest. But there was a lightness to his step now. He wasn't just fighting for his past. He was fighting for their future. Cliffhanger. As David and Elena walked down the hallway, Elena's voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked. David turned to her, a calm, knowing look in his eyes. "This is just the beginning." And with that, they stepped into the future, one that David would lead with integrity, strength, and the promise of change. The sun was low in the sky as David walked through the office, his footsteps a quiet rhythm against the polished floors. The buzz of the workplace was different now. There was no longer an undercurrent of fear or tension hanging in the air. Instead, the sounds were warm. Laughter, light conversations, the soft click of keyboards as employees worked with purpose, no longer afraid to speak up. David had changed the company. But more importantly, he had changed the culture. The toxic grip Claire had once held over everyone was now just a distant memory. For the first time in his life, David felt like he was where he was meant to be. In the break room, Elena smiled as she watched the interaction between David and the staff. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. David chuckled. "I never thought it would feel like this." He had spent years in the shadows, holding back, wondering if he would ever get the chance to truly lead. And now, standing in the middle of the very place that had once dismissed him, he realized something. He was exactly where he needed to be. Not because of the title, but because of what he was doing. Under David's leadership, the company began to thrive. Ethical practices became the foundation of every decision. They made sure that employees were not just cogs in a machine, but valued members of a greater purpose. They instituted fair wages, transparent policies, and a renewed commitment to community outreach. The focus shifted to development, both of the company and the people within it. David didn't just change the way the company operated. He changed how people saw their work, their worth, and their place in the world. Employees who had once been overlooked, like Raphael and Lucas, now thrived. And they weren't the only ones. The company's outreach programs flourished, providing mentorship and support to local communities. The business was successful, and it was thriving because of its integrity. David had proven that a business could grow without sacrificing its core values. He had proved that doing things the right way was the best way. But while the company flourished, Claire's downfall was inevitable. Her world had crumbled, and it was a bitter pill for her to swallow. Her manipulations, her lies, her abuse of power, all of it had been exposed. And now, she was left to reflect on everything she had lost. David knew that the damage was done. He could have pursued legal action, could have made sure she paid for every single injustice she'd committed, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to take the higher ground. He wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in moving forward, in building something better for the future, for everyone. As Claire walked out of the office for the last time, head down, carrying her personal items in a box, David watched from his office window. There was no satisfaction in the sight, no sense of victory, just peace. Later that afternoon, David walked through the bustling office, the same halls he had once walked as a silent outsider. This time, however, there was a sense of belonging. The employees looked up from their desks and smiled as he passed. Some of them nodded, others waved. He had earned their respect, not with threats or manipulation, but with his quiet resolve. The humility with which he had risen through the ranks, and more importantly, his vision for a better, fairer company had won them over. At his desk, a new employee, Jessie, fumbled with the printer. David paused, watching her struggle. She was young, eager, and clearly overwhelmed by the new job. David's footsteps were soft as he approached her. He leaned over, his voice low and comforting. "Let me show you a quicker way," he said. Jessie looked up, startled. But then, when she saw his warm smile, she relaxed, her tension melting away. "Thanks, Mr. David," she said, grateful for the help. David smiled back. "Just David," he replied, as he helped her with the printer. The small act was a reminder to him. Leadership was never about the title. It was about the people you served. David's office had changed too. The walls that had once been barren and cold were now adorned with inspirational quotes from the community, the ones who had inspired him along the way. One quote stood above all others: "For the people who build, not break." It was a quote that summed up everything David believed in, everything he stood for. And it was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. The company was thriving, yes, but David had set out to build more than just a business. He had set out to build a community, one where everyone had a voice, where everyone mattered, and where no one was ever dismissed or forgotten again. As the day came to a close, David looked out his office window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. It had been a long journey, but it had all led him to this moment. He had reclaimed his company, but more importantly, he had reclaimed his dignity. And now, as the evening settled in, he couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. Cliffhanger. As David sat back in his chair, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Alina. Her words were simple. "There's something you need to see. It's not over yet." David's heart skipped a beat. What was Alina referring to? What was still to come? The weight of the message pressed down on him, but David's resolve remained firm. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about something far larger. And he was ready. Ready for whatever came next. "Harold. But he was with me." David's voice cracked with disbelief. "He was on my side." "Not anymore," Elena replied. "Harold's been feeding Claire insider information. He's been trying to get you out, slowly and quietly, while making you think everything was going well. All of this, your success, the changes, he's been trying to destroy it from within." David felt the weight of the betrayal like a punch to the gut. This was the final blow. The one person he had trusted most, Harold, had been playing both sides. As David sat in stunned silence, Elena continued. "But there's more. Harold has ties to external investors, some of the biggest shareholders in the company. If they find out about the financial discrepancies, they could use that against you. It's a well-crafted plan, David. One where you're the fall guy, and they walk away clean." David gritted his teeth. "No." He slammed his fist on the table. "I won't let him get away with this. I've come too far." The room fell silent, the weight of the situation settling on both of them. David could feel the walls closing in. Harold's betrayal wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on everything David had fought for. But he wouldn't back down. He couldn't. David stood up, his resolve solidifying. "I'm not going to let them take what we've built." He turned to Elena. "We have to act fast. We need to expose Harold before he can turn the board against me." Elena nodded. "I've already reached out to some of the other employees who have been watching Harold closely. We have the evidence. It's time to put it all out in the open." That evening, David called an emergency meeting with the board. Harold was there, sitting at the head of the table, his usual air of confidence still intact. But today, David could see the cracks beneath the surface. Harold knew the end was near. As the meeting progressed, David laid out the evidence, each piece of proof carefully planned and presented. He exposed Harold's betrayal, his ties to the investors who had been secretly pulling the strings. Claire wasn't the only threat. Harold had been the real mastermind behind the scenes. The board members sat in stunned silence. No one had expected this. The truth hit them like a tidal wave. They had been blind to the man they trusted most. Cliffhanger. The vote came fast. The board was ready to make a decision. Harold was out. David was in. The chairman's eyes flickered to David, acknowledging his rightful place. But as Harold was escorted out of the room, his voice rang out in one final defiant shout. "This isn't over, David. People like me always come out on top." David, standing tall, said nothing. He had already won. But the real work, the real change, was just beginning. As David walked back to his office, Elena by his side, he knew that his journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something bigger. Something far more meaningful than just running a company. It was about creating a legacy, a future, and a culture that would outlast the schemers. David smiled, the weight of his fight finally lifting. "For the people who build, not break," he whispered, looking at the plaque on his office wall. And with that, he stepped into the future. Final note. Justice had been served, not just for David, but for the entire company. The future was brighter, more hopeful, and in the hands of the people who truly believed in it.